In this episode of Lab Matters with me, Harriet Gould, I'm joined by geneticist, author, and broadcaster Adam Rutherford, who opens up about almost everything. Today, I'm joined by Adam Rutherford, scientist, writer, and broadcaster. Now, I think of you, Adam, as a geneticist, but then when I put your name in Google, you came up as the president of the British Humanist Society. Is that right? Which was that what?
Yeah, I mean, there was a pause in the way you said that, and you just said the president. I'm
You
like,
are the
yeah,
president.
sure,
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, I'll take that.
You're president for all of us now.
Yeah,
Um,
Humanist UK. I'm the current president. Each one of us is a 3-year term. Alice Roberts was before me, and we don't know who's after me.
so is it, and it's so 3 years. How far into your 3 years are you?
This is my last year, so we will
Okay.
be someone else will be taking up that accolade soon.
Hmm. Now, I also said I thought of you as a geneticist, and in addition to that, I definitely think I've described you once before as being a movie star. Um,
I think that is inaccurate. I am a geneticist. I mean, what are the qualifications for being described as a geneticist? Um, I have my first degree is in genetics, my second degree is in genetics, and I am a lecturer in genetics at UCL. So I feel like that might, that if
Justified,
there's a threshold, I feel like I might have passed it.
but not
But
not
for
not.
movie star though, um, I have not yet starred in any major movies.
But which movies have got your fingerprints in them?
Oh, that's a different question. Yeah, I have worked on a number of films over the years as a scientific consultant, which involves script writing and working with actors and working with designers and often graphic designers on certain movies. And some of the highlights I worked on a number of Alex Garland films. So I worked on Ex Machina, which was 2015, and Annihilation, which had Natalie Portman and Tessa Thompson in it. And I worked on a film with Ryan Reynolds and Jake Gyllenhaal and Rebecca Ferguson called Life. And then I worked on World War Z. There's a few. Morbius, the Living Vampire, I think was the last one I had a significant contribution to. Wasn't great.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, I mean, I feel pretty ignorant now because I haven't seen any of these films or even really heard of them. I'm embarrassed to say. But it didn't come out of nowhere, actually. I think you worked when you worked at Nature, you were in charge of the audio content, audio and visual content. Is that right? So you had an understanding of what worked on screen in addition to having that scientific knowledge that can contribute to accuracy in other art forms like movies. Did
Yeah, I guess so. But I think my love of cinema predates all of working at Nature. I think it was really trying to when I was at Nature, I was an editor, and this was in the early 2000s. So it was just at the point where the internet was taking off, and we had one of the first podcasts. So I launched the Nature podcast in 2005, which is now 20 years ago, which seems like a long time, but um, we had my head of department was very forward looking. He was very internet savvy, and one of the things that we wanted to do was just expand into this new territory. And one of the ways that we could do it was through audio, and one way it was through video. And I took on those responsibilities mostly because I like telling stories more than anything else. So the scientific, I'd been a working scientist up till the end of my PhD. And then I went to work for Nature as an editor. Just for a change of pace, I wanted to talk about science more than do it. And then the audio and the video aspect of it emerged out of that because fundamentally I'm I, I'm interested in science communication and public understanding of science. And one of the ways you can do that effectively in this era is through video and audio. 20 years later, everyone's got a podcast. I think it's law that men
law?
over the age of
Absolutely.
45 have to have a podcast. Um, and here I am talking
And
to
here
you
we
on a
are. Yeah,
podcast.
indeed. I'm not a man over the age of 45 though, so I slightly jumped the gun.
Yeah, good for you. But yeah, that was where it all started. And then trying to do videos was interesting because we were sort of looking at academic papers, often quite technical papers that were coming into Nature and being published in Nature, and then working out how to tell a video story version of it aimed at a very broad audience as part of the sort of dissemination of complex but important science. So
Hmm.
yeah, you're right. I did learn some of my chops on doing that. But then quite quickly after that, I started to work in TV, and so I suppose that was part of that process as well.
Hmm. And this storytelling, had that always been something that you'd been aware of the fact that you were A, good at, and B, enjoyed doing? When was the first time you formulated that realization consciously?
Well, it's nice that you say I'm good at it. Um, I think that I'm not sure there's a specific moment where I thought, oh, this is interesting. This is what I want to do. But I think that everything is story to a certain degree, and I think that one of the things missing from science publishing as part of the broader science communication environment ecosystem is the very natural, the very human inclination to tell stories. You know, almost all academic papers are terribly written and contain nuggets of probably important information buried in impenetrable technical jargon and prose that could and indeed these days is being written by artificial intelligences. And there's no reason for that because I think that we separate science communication out from science, but which I think is a false dichotomy. All science is science communication. There are no aspects of science that don't involve communicating your work, your experiments, your results, other papers, other ideas to other people. Science that is not communicated has no value whatsoever. And yet, whilst we teach school children and undergraduates and people who become working career scientists, we teach them the tools of their trade, such as lab techniques or how to do PCRs or statistical techniques or computational techniques, and all of the things, all of the nuts and bolts of how to be a good research scientist. And until very recently, and not universally to this day, we do not teach them the fundamentals of how to communicate, which is an old profession of which there are huge volumes of scholarship. And more than that, as communicators, as humans, natural communicators, we've been telling stories for tens of thousands of years. So it's a complete gap in the process of science and the training of science that at no stage do we actually tell people what it is to speak in public, what it is to write, how to write a paper, or how to write a summary of a paper, or how to write an abstract, or how to tell any story, or how to write news journalism or features, or how to make a video, or how to design a freaking slide. You and I and many of your listeners who presumably are scientists will have sat in front of literally tens of thousands of images projected onto screens that are just aesthetically and data visualizationally awful. And I think I, part of my mission as a working scientist, but also as a public communicator, is don't do that, right? This, we know how to. We know there are real experts in storytelling that exist in the world that we pay money to read books by, or listen to podcasts or radio by, or watch TV or films, and we could do with more of that in science. So that's the sort of niche I've carved out.
Hmm. I think it's a good niche. Did you have any teachers that were particularly good at storytelling at school? Um, I mean, I had teachers that really caught my imagination. They would dress up in character when they were teaching us about whatever it might be. Joseph, teaching us about that, and it would be a complete ensemble in that term. We'd have to learn the whole musical and dress up as a characters, and our teacher would come in with his Technicolor dream coat and explain it, and I guess
Are you going to sing? Because there is a
I
piano in the
can,
background.
yeah, I don't play.
Sure, I don't believe you.
I won't sing on this occasion. But I still do know the words to that entire musical, surely because of that term at
Sure.
school. And that particular teacher who took it upon himself to inspire us to learn about that part of history in that way.
Mm.
And I just wondered if you'd had anything like that in
Well,
the science side of things, or otherwise.
actually, my English teacher at school was particularly good at that. I didn't do English A level, but until GCSE, I had an English teacher whose name was Mr. Kitchen, who was a bit like the sort of Robin Williams character in Dead Poets Society, in that he was not very interested in the curriculum and he was not very interested in the set texts other than Macbeth, which I love, that we were required to do for GCSE. And he took us to the theatre and he took us to London and took us to see plays. And I think that was very inspiring. The real person who set me on this path, though, was Steve Jones. So Professor Steve Jones, who's a geneticist in my department, he's still alive. He's still claiming that I'm trying to steal his career. But he was my undergraduate tutor and he still teaches first year genetics. We calculated that roughly we think it's about 10, between 10 and 15,000 students have been taught by him over the last 40 years or so. And he is, apart from being an excellent evolutionary biologist, evolutionary geneticist, he's just a excellent storyteller. And his books, the first significant one of which was called The Language of the Genes, which came out in 1992, I think it was, so before the Human Genome Project. And I reread it recently, and it still stands up. It's not up to date, but there's nothing in it which is sort of heinously wrong. And other books written at that time do contain things which are now heinously wrong. Um, but he's got this. Steve comes from a working class Welsh background, and he all of his stories about genetics have this sort of rooted in them. So they are stories about people, which fundamentally is what genetics, human genetics is. He jokes that our job is to make sex boring. That's one of his lines. But really, when you think about what genetics actually is, it is the study of inheritance, it's the study of disease, it's the study of sex as well, and it is all of those things that are sort of fundamentally everyone's experienced lived lives. And so his narratives about teaching genetics were very based in stories about people, and I really loved that. I was a fan of Dawkins's, seminal work in evolutionary genetics, such as The Selfish Gene and The Blind Watchmaker, but he's very much a professorial writer, and there is a sort of grandiloquence to Dawkins's work, which is a particular taste that is not particularly mine. So it was, although Richard Dawkins has been an influence intellectually to me and also as a communicator, I think it's Steve that really set me on this pathway. My best-selling book, which is called A Brief History of Everyone Who Ever Lived, is unofficially dedicated. Well, it's officially dedicated to Steve, but it's unofficially a sequel to The Language of the Genes, written in 2016. So, this is where we've come in the 20 years since he was writing his, and in the sort of, well, it would have been sort of 16 years since the Human Genome Project had finished. And I wanted to do the same, tell stories about people. And if people remember some of those stories, then you're doing your job.
Mm. It's interesting, isn't it? Because people get a bit enclosed in their own lives and almost forget to think of themselves as part of something bigger,
Hmm.
more historic. So yeah, maybe they'll read your book and remind themselves that that's exactly what they are.
Well, I hope so. And I think that a big chunk of my work is about, which maybe we'll talk about, but emerges out of studying evolutionary genetics, is understanding the history of the field, which is a very pernicious history because it's very closely associated with scientific racism and the political ideology of eugenics. But one of the things that I'm interested in, and I think this comes out in Steve's work as well, is to counter the view that science is apolitical, that this system that we call science, or the science methodologies, is designed to minimize human interaction and human biases and political and psychological biases and cultural baggage from our understanding of reality, right? That's the goal. And the methodologies that we employ are designed to minimize those biases, which is great. But we can only do it if we can only minimize those biases if we really, really try very hard. And the history of science is replete with people trying to do it, but in post hoc analysis, we know that they weren't. They were subject to the cultural and psychological and political biases of their days. And so the idealized goal of science being apolitical and amoral, and data being clean and amoral and with no biases built into it, are fantasies. Now, sometimes I say these sorts of things, and I've got a couple of talks where the provocations at the very beginning are that all data is biased and all science is political. And they are provocations, but I also think they're true. And that pisses a lot of scientists off. I get a lot of pushback from people saying, "No, this is your political biases," or "No, it's not." Well, the data set I work on is neutral. It's obviously more the case in the biological sciences, and the closer you work to humans, the more political and the more baggages come with it. I remember giving a version of this talk about racial biases in science, as part of political bias in science, to a bunch of astronomers at UCL where I work. And one of them said, "Look, I study the transition of extrasolar planets across stars, um, billions of miles away. How is that political?" And, one has to admit that is not the same as if you're working on the Human Genome Project and you're working with different populations from around the world, and therefore all sorts of cultural and possibly racial histories play into that work. But the fact of the matter is that guy's not entitled to work on that. Someone wrote that grant and was given that grant by an organization who had to make choices about who got that money and who built that telescope and who was in the lab that he's working on. No one has the right to work on transiting of planets across extrasolar domains. So there is politics in every aspect of science, and if we don't recognize that, then we're oblivious to the reality of the prejudices that are inherent in society and in our sciences. So, later in the interview, you're going to ask me what I would change about science, and that's one of the things I would change. I'd make it compulsory for people to do their due diligence on history.
I mean, I'd go one step further even because what you're talking about is the output of politics having an effect on science. Whereas from my perspective, politics is people and science is people.
Agreed.
So, that'll give everyone something to think about, perhaps.
Yeah, I
But
think I
yeah.
think that's I think that's 100% true. Science is not this sort of perfect entity that floats above us that we can tap into. Science is a social activity. It is done by people, and it's not just done by individuals. It's done by people in groups interacting with each other. And that's a sort of follow on to my point about all science being communication.
Mm.
If you're working on your own and never share your results, you might as well not be doing anything at all. So the politics of just existence, of being a human, are inherent to that process. And yes, we try to minimize it. But the fact of the matter is that I work at a major university where the incentive structure for success and promotion are publications in privately owned journals, whose criteria for success are determined by individuals who have specific commercially orientated objectives themselves. It gets peer reviewed for free and then published, for which we have to then subsequently pay for. And the universities are struggling for funding in this current environment. So the success of departments is reliant on the success of individuals bringing in grants, which are dependent on publications, which are dependent on private businesses, and so on. Now, you don't have to be a raging communist to look at this system and say that this is a political system. At almost no point in the discussions we have about publishing in journals, promotions in academia, and all of the ecosystem that surrounds academic research, particularly in science, at no point do we ask the question, does this serve science itself? All of those decisions, all of those those aspects of how the jobs that we do work are political things. So
Mm,
we can beaver away at the lab and generate results which we think are the closest version to an empirical reality as possible. But the way it happened and the way we talk about it, those things are inherently and non-negotiably political.
mm. And as are we, as people.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
literally, people are literally politics. The word comes from, polis, the population, the people.
exactly,
It's
exactly.
all one. We're all
I
one.
spend a lot of my academic time about 100 years ago looking at the people in my academic uh, ancestry in evolutionary biology and more broadly in biology and being critical, contextually critical. I'm effectively a historian as well as a geneticist, and being critical of their work and looking at it and looking at the legacies of contemporary thinking, of their thinking and their relationship to their own cultural and political and personal biases, and what the legacies of those biases are in their work and in our work today. Right.
Mm.
So you get a lot of pushback from people saying, well, you're just a bleeding heart liberal, you're woke, and it's all about cancelling, and all those sort of glib, slightly meaningless,
Cancelling.
catchphrasy things that people talk about a lot these days.
You're,
I have
you're
no doubt that
accused
in
of
100 years'
cancelling.
time, people will do the same for us, and that's how it should be. That's the process.
I'm surprised to hear people say that you're doing cancelling. I thought you didn't. I, what are they accusing you of cancelling?
Well, I mean, not, I do get accused of that, but I'm not cancel. I'm not even interested in the concept of cancel culture. I'm not even sure it's a real thing. But there are several intellectual grandees in my area, which
Mm,
is evolutionary genetics, whose associations with eugenics in the late 19th and early 20th century are pretty grotesque. Now, my job as a geneticist and historian is to understand the context of the work that they did and the context of the political views that they did, right? It is for
mm,
others to decide whether they want their names removed from buildings, which is what happened at UCL with um, several of these grandees, Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, and Ron Fisher being the three. And I have views about removing people's names from buildings or from statues or whatever, but I slightly don't care. But the thing I do care about is if we're going to do that, then we use those as moments to teach those histories. The accusations that you're erasing history are true if you remove the names without saying why. And so I teach a course, I teach a module at UCL for third years called Genetics and Society, and we talk about these things. Why the building that I was taught in was called the Galton Laboratory, but Galton is no longer present at UCL. Why the left-hand side of the entrance to UCL was called the Pearson Building and is now called the Northwest Wing. Now, if you just call it the Northwest Wing and don't say why it was the Pearson and why it's not, then you are erasing history, and that's not okay. But it's also important to recognize that no one is entitled to have a building named after them. And the act of naming a building after someone is a political act. So the removal of that name is also a political act. And that is the history of that building. Now, that's the history that we need to be talking about. So yeah, I do. I get lots of angry emails from um, very old professors saying you shouldn't do this. And that's fine because when I'm 90, I expect younger people than I will write to me and say, "You're an old fart and you thought this." And I'll go, "Yeah, you're probably right." I hope I remember this conversation when I'm in my 90s.
I hope you've got a building named after you when you're in your 90s.
But that's a funny thing, though, isn't it, about science? Is that if the whole purpose of science is to remove personal biases and baggages and cultural prejudices from a process of understanding science or understanding reality, well, why the hell do we name things after people anyway?
I think I don't think it necessarily is the because what you're talking about is effectively a clarity and a cleansing process that means that it's less messy and I'm not sure that that will ever be the case in humanity. We do live a messy lives and we can sometimes I think gloss over that in artificial frameworks such as business or other organizations, but life itself and humanity itself is quite messy.
Mm.
So yeah, I think names of things and points in history and yes, okay, like you say, it's never going to be nothing can ever be erased. People can try, but people like you to make the most of things like that happening by teaching the impact of what's happened to other people. And other people don't, they might just gloss over it. But either way, nothing ever goes away and the mess continues.
Yes, well, yes, I think, and I think that's fine. I mean, lives are messy, but I think that I think a lot of people glide through these narratives without really taking any interest in why they're there, and then get angry when people can contest them.
That's true.
And that's fine, and that's part of the process. But well, I'm just interested in good scholarship about them rather than them being needlessly politicized or ne weaponized. Everything is politicized, but things being weaponized is poor form and not helpful for discourse.
Mm,
So, these are interesting histories. Some of them are difficult histories. I like the trajectory of the history of science because it's not it is progressive. It is inherently progressive in a way that the history of history is not inherently. But I do think that we have a slightly different problem, which is that in the 19th century, the formulation of what became known as great man theory, so the great man theory of history, which is Carlyle really formalized it, but the notion that it pivots on major events that are the actions of significant individuals, and by individuals, I only mean men, and that these either divine or just special creation men are the actors of history, and everyone else are just you know bit players. Now, that is kind of how we were taught history. We do the history of kings and queens and we do the great battles. But about 30 or 40 years ago, maybe a bit longer, academic history started to move away from great man theory and into, I think, a much more interesting version of history, which is to try and center the voices of the people who aren't these supposedly divinely inspired gods who walk amongst us. And as a result, we've got histories which are bottom up and which involve centering the voices of the unheard, including women and people not of white northwestern European extraction, and so on. And so as a result of that, we've got a much better understanding of history. And history is always changing, and it reflects contemporary mores, and that's I love the phrase when people accuse you of rewriting history, to which the response is yes, that is what historians do. But I think that the history of science has not made that same step. And I think we're still rather wedded to a great man version of the history of science, where we
mm,
can track a line from Aristotle all the way to, I don't know, Stephen Hawking, without mentioning a woman and without breaking a step. And it's not an accurate representation of how science actually works. It's not an accurate representation of those individual people, and it's really misrepresentative of this sort of grand endeavor that we do. So
mm,
I'd like that to change. I'd like us to fully abandon great man theory in science and start looking at the history of science as a much more collective endeavor that is punctuated by the works of brilliant people.
mhm,
But I do take the view as well that science is different from history and that everything is waiting to be discovered, right? If Darwin, who I do think was a great man and a great genius, if he hadn't come up with evolution by natural selection in 1858, then someone else would have done. In fact, we know that already did happen. It was Wallace who prompted him to publish, and they both presented their ideas at the same meeting. Actually, neither of them were present because Wallace was away and Darwin was sick. But but if Wallace and Darwin hadn't have existed, someone would have discovered evolution by natural selection at some point between 1858 and I don't know when. So Darwin's contribution to the history of thinking is profound. I think the greatest of all great thinkers. But if he hadn't have existed, his ideas still would have existed. And I suppose that isn't the same for history. There are always the counterfactuals, which I think are really interesting in history, but some historians don't like them. You know, what if Hitler had died as a baby? What if Stalin had died as a baby? What if, you know, all of those sorts of things. But if Darwin had never existed, then evolution still exists.
You're right, because you can conceive of scenarios where this might have happened or that might have happened, i.e., the same scenario could play out, but with science, that's a certainty.
Yes, because we're trying to uncover an objective reality. And the methods by which we do that and the culture in which we do that are all contingent on history and people and personalities and politics. But the
Mm.
thing we're trying to find out is just there, right? It's there. It's waiting to be discovered. You know, you come from a more chemistry background, right? The periodic table is the same in the whole of the universe. We're only waiting for someone to come along and work out that it's constructed in that particular way. Um, and that is different from history. But anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
that's my mode of thinking on this.
It's really interesting. And the thing is, we could talk about this for a long time, and you've touched on it already, and we're going to run out of time. So I'll just press you for a definitive on the question. What is the one thing, the everything, the one thing that you would change if you could about science
Yeah,
that isn't how
yes,
people
you asked me to have a
communicate
think
it?
about this, and my
Yeah,
answer was everything, which
everything.
I
That
know
is
is
one thing.
yeah, it is, and but it requires qualification, obviously, because science is it's an amazing endeavor and it's an incredible thing, and it's you know humanity civilization is built on the back of science and all of those things, and I'm not in any way dissing that it isn't a good thing. Science is in service of people, but I think that there are so many structural problems in science right now that I wonder whether it is the ecosystem that we were talking about earlier is fit for purpose anymore. And the incentive structures in academia are wrong. The incentive structures in for publishing are wrong. The notion that science is self-correcting, which is one of the sort of mantras that we always say, and that's one of its great virtues. Science is self-correcting, but only if we do that self-correction. And so um, I think you asked me what I would change.
What about the first thing, maybe?
I think I would. I'm going to take a sort of revolutionary view on this, which is not very responsible, and I'm not going to provide a solution, but I'm going to tell you what I would do. I would take academic publishing, not limited to science, but I would take academic publishing overall, and I would burn it to the ground. And then I'd take the ashes and I'd eat them. And then I'd shoot them again, just to make sure they were dead. And then I'd get some people to design a new system that will no doubt in 100 years' time be criticized for being political and all of the things that I'm complaining about now and with all the wrong incentive structures. But this is a system that does not work. It is not in service of science. It is not in service of the pursuit of truth via scientific means. And that seems to be one of the most obvious barriers to the dissemination of what we regard as this wonderful thing, which is science.
I've got a supplementary question.
Go on.
What do you think of open access publishing?
I think the principle is great. I think that if you are funded by taxpayers, by people, then the public, then you have responsibility to the people who pay for your work to that they should have access to the fruits of your labor. I think there are many complications within the whole broad concept of open access, but it is not right to me that private companies ask academics to work for free in peer review to review the work that has been done mostly paid for by taxpayers, and that so So taxpayers pay for the work, academics work for free, and journals charge for read for access to reading that work. Now, if you describe that system to a mafia boss, he would say, I want a slice of that action. You know, no one has ever come up with a more sophisticated scam than scientific publishing than the one that we operate within today. So I would say, yes, open access is definitely a thing that needs to grow and to happen, but there are complexities within that which we're not talking about. So I like the idea.
Lovely. Well, Adam, we will leave it there. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Always nice to see you, Harriet.
Did you enjoy that episode of Lab Matters? If you did, please do send it to the people that you think will enjoy it the most.